1940s, a group of Russian researchers discovered an experimental gas-based stimulant which could eradicate the need for sleep in humans. 5 test subjects were chosen to test the gas, all deemed enemies of the state. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake, as the gas was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so their only means of monitoring the subjects were microphones and a few thick glass portholes into the chamber. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on, running water, a toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. Everything was 5 for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely, that they would be freed if they did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored closely, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past life, and the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate signs of paranoia. They stopped talking to one another, and began alternately whispering to the microphones and portholes. Oddly, they seemed to think they could win the trust of their researchers by turning over their fellow comrades. At first, the researchers suspected that this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. After he tore his vocal cords, he still continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or didn't react to it. They continued whispering into the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 3 non-screaming captives took books apart, smearing page after page with their own feces and pasted them over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped, and so did the whispering in the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they weren't working, as they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming from the chamber. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke a response from the captives. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard one single phrase in a calm voice respond, "We no longer wish to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the government officials funding the experiment. Unable to provoke any other response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. That night, the chamber was flushed of the gas and filled with fresh air. Immediately, voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different subjects began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside the chamber. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one can rightly call the state that any of them were in living. The food rations for the past 5 days had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of rotting flesh from the dead subject's thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, which allowed 4 inches of red liquid to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the liquid that was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that all of them were self-inflicted. The organs below the rib cages of all 4 test subjects had been removed. While the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place, the skin and muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the ribcage. All the removed blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all four could be seen working, digesting what was apparently their own flesh, which they had been eating for many days. Most of the soldiers were Russian operatives, but still, many refused to return to that chamber in order to remove the test subjects. The subjects continued to scream to be left alone in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another, gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. 5 more soldiers lost their lives, if you count ones that committed suicide. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and was bleeding out quickly. The medical staff attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the normal human dose of morphine, and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the arm of one doctor. His heart continued beating for a full 2 minutes after he ran out of blood. Even after his heart stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word, "More! More!" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to the medical facility, the 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back in his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him to sleep. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on his wrist. It took little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject, it was found that his blood had triple the normal level of oxygen found in a human body. The muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in a struggle to not be subdued. The second survivor had been the first of the group to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head very violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought out. He shook his head yes when a nurse suggested that they try the surgery without anesthetic. He did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what little remained of his skin. The surgeon stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the subject to still be alive. One terrified nurse stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk. Assuming this must be something of importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so he could write out his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic. The surgeon found it almost impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were asking for the gas. The researchers tried asking why. Why had they injured themselves? Why had they ripped out their own organs? Why did they want the gas? Only one response was given. I must remain awake.